In this last year, well, I don't know, maybe it's been a few years. I've really gotten to I started researching a gentleman, and some of the things that he was saying. I don't remember where I first heard of David Barton, but I started listening to one of your books, and I can't even remember. I'm terrible at names of these names, but I learned so much about how Christianity and how, let's say, how faith, I don't want to say just Christianity, how faith plays a role in government and how it should play a role in government and how our morals and our liberties are all given to us through our Creator. And so, anyway, David Barton has been an amazing, I'll call him a role model in a way, for me, as I've been learning more and more about the Constitution, our forefathers, the true history. And when I don't remember when it wasn't too long ago, he came out here to Utah and was with Glenn Beck. And I was just amazed at what I learned in that meeting, in that event, about ESG and about everything that's going on, and I just I've always had so much respect for him. And then recently I started listening to I do Audible books. I'm not a reader. I'm a listener. I started listening to a book called This Precarious Moment: 6 Urgent Steps That Will Save You, Your Family, and Our Country. And again, I'm just every chapter I've learned so much from him. And so when the opportunity came along to ask him to come out, I was like, yeah, we'll never get him. We'll never get his time. He's such a busy guy. He's so good. But immediately his secretary, oh yeah, he'd love to come out. He loves Utah. And I couldn't believe it. And so I want to thank you, David, first of all, for being willing to come out today. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate it. I don't know exactly what you're going to share, but I know that I've always been inspired by your words. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and welcome you to the stage. And by the way, I'd also like to introduce your wife. So, thank you both for coming out. And I want to hand it over to you and let you take over.
I've got one right here.
Oh, you've got one.
Got it.
All right, that's right.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it very much. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks for letting me share with you tonight and be here. It is a blessing. I do love Utah. I will disagree with you that Utah is the best state in the nation. I think Texas. But that's a fun debate to have, too. So I love the fact that we all love our states, because we will then fight for the right things in our states, and that's a good deal. And that's why the whole concept of what they're calling Christian dominionism, Christian nationalism is such a bad deal. It's telling people you shouldn't love your country. If you're a Christian, you shouldn't do that. That's a really bad deal. If you love your country, you're going to seek the best for it. If you love your family, you seek the best for it. So the whole concept of trying to tear down patriotism, which is very active in education right now, I'm involved. We do a whole lot with education. Let me background. We have 160,000 original documents from American history, original artifacts, things from Columbus all the way through, a Bible, the landing on the moon of Apollo 14. We have 2 museums in Texas. They're well attended. A lot of people come. And so we can see a lot about history. And as a result, I've been appointed in a number of states, with state boards of education, legislatures, etc., to do history standards and social studies standards in their states. And it is amazing to see what's there. I'm going to cover some of that tonight. What I want to cover tonight is show you how special America is, show you why she's special, and show you 3 areas where she's special. And I will just about guarantee you that most of our kids get none of what I'm about to share with you. So let me begin with a Bible verse. The scripture is out of Psalms 10:22. It's a very simple scripture. Proverbs 10:22. It says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and He adds no sorrow to it." Now, God's blessing is something that enriches our life. Easy, understandable. I learned a whole lot about this verse from a founding father named Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, ratified the Constitution. John Adams said of all our 250 founding fathers, he said the 3 most notable founding fathers, number 1 is George Washington, number 2 is Ben Franklin, number 3 is Benjamin Rush. We know nearly nothing about this guy today, and he was one of the top 3. And it's interesting, we have a lot of his handwritten documents, including his prayer journal. We have a lot of his writings in his prayer journal. And one of the things he pointed out was just as a guy of faith, as a guy who loved God, as a guy who loved the scriptures, he was writing down his blessings, and he was thanking God for all these blessings he was enjoying. And I'm reading them, going, yeah, that's a good one, that's a good one, check, check. And he got to one where he said, I thank God for all the times I have not fallen down the stairs. Well, that's kind of strange. May I point out, I just went up the stairs and didn't fall. Nobody noticed that. You know why you didn't notice it? Some of the greatest blessings you have are things you don't notice. See, if I'd fallen, you would have noticed that. That wouldn't have been a blessing. The fact that I didn't fall is a blessing. See, it's like your health until something loses it. We take it for granted. It's like our family until something happens. We take it for granted. So many things we take for granted. I think there is no nation in the world that takes more for granted than we do in America. I think as Americans, we have more blessings than any other nation, and we really take more of them for granted. And if you listen to education, we're the worst nation in the world. I mean, we're really happy to criticize ourselves, 1619 Project, critical race theory, whatever it is. We're one of 193 nations in the world today. That number changes from year to year. In the founding era, there was 128 nations in the world. There's 193 today. But what you have is you have thousands of nations over the course of 5,800 years of recorded history. And as you look at those thousands of nations, Cornell University Law School said, you know, there's a lot of forms of government. There's been a lot of constitutions, a lot of nations. And they asked the question, they said, what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And they went back over 5,800 years, and they came up and they said the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. That's what it's been for 5,800 years. Last September the 17th on Constitution Day, we celebrated 235 years from the Constitution. There's no one who's ever come close to that, not by a long shot, and we got people wanting to tear it down and replace it with something. No, what we've got is once in history kind of stuff, and we don't appreciate it as much. Even when we look at how we are as a people, we're only 4% of the world's population. Yet when it comes to creativity, we measure creativity through international copyright, international patent protection, etc. When you look at inventions that have been done across the world, our 4% in America has produced more than 96% of the inventions in the world. We are surrounded by benefits and technology and things we take for granted. And we just assume that what we got is normal and natural. It's not. We have a blessing that the rest of the nation doesn't enjoy. And the Constitution requires that every 10 years we do a census. So we did a census 2020. And when you look at American prosperity, our 4% of the world's population, every year we produce 23, 24, 25% of the world's GDP. So we're a very prosperous nation. Does that break down individually? Yes, because when we did the census in 2020, the results released in 2021, and according to the U.S. Census in 2021, if you live below the poverty level in America, and we don't want anyone living below the poverty level in America, but if you live below the poverty level in America, your lifestyle is higher than middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. It's amazing that if you're in Hawaii, if you're in Mississippi right now, they say, look, unless you can make more than $61,000 a year, you should not come off government services, because those are kids on government services. That's poverty in America? Really? Now, we don't want anybody poor. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is we have blessings at a level that we just don't understand. And we just take those for granted. And so the blessings that we have, we enjoy. This is called American exceptionalism. And one of the interesting things I find at the university level particularly is a lot of books coming out like this. We've been called an exceptional nation since 1835. Alexis Tocqueville is the first one who came here and said, what you guys have is exceptional. It's not like any other nation. We are the exception. We're not the rule. And yet professors say, no. America's not special. America's really got to be changed because she's fundamentally flawed. And we've got all these things on why we don't like America. And yet America is very special. And when you look at America and why we're special, you look at the documents we have. This thing that we call American exceptionalism, what is it that produced American exceptionalism? What philosophy? Because there's a philosophy behind every government. 193 nations in the world today, every government has a philosophy. And that philosophy is really important. Now, philosophy is set forth, in our case, in the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, just to define American exceptionalism, because professors like to redefine it to make their point, American exceptionalism is defined as describing the unprecedented stability, freedom, and prosperity that is the result of institutions and policies that are produced by unique governing philosophy. Now, this is what made us exceptional. Notice the sequence. We have a governing philosophy, and from that philosophy, that's how we create our institutions and our policies. Those institutions and policies is what produces the stability, the freedom, all the things we like. But the most important part is our philosophy of government. And if you remember 8th grade earth science, remember 8th grade earth science, we were told there were 3 parts to a fruit tree. Those 3 parts to a fruit tree, you have the bottom part where you put the seed in, or the seedling. If you were planting trees, you had a seedling, but either a seed or tree. And so that was the bottom part. Then that would produce the second part, which was the infrastructure, the trunk and the branches and everything that would support. It's all the infrastructure. And finally, you get the fruit as a result of that. And so whatever you planted, that's the kind of fruit you're going to get up top. And people enjoy the fruit. They don't really care about the seed that's planted. They don't care about the infrastructure. They like the apples or the bananas or the pears or whatever it is that comes off the tree. And that's the way government is. When you look at it, what we planted was a philosophy. We planted a seed. That seed was in our founding documents. It's a very simple philosophy, but that's what we used to produce the infrastructure. Based on that seed we planted, we said, here's the kind of infrastructure it takes to have what we want here. And the result of that has been the fruit. Now, everybody in the world wants to come to America and eat the fruit we've got here. That's why we have right now 137 different nations lined up on the southern border. 137 nations we know of lined up on the southern border trying to get in. Everybody wants the fruit we've got on the tree. Well, they've got their own nations, but they don't have the same fruit. Why? Because they didn't plant the same seed. The most important thing is the seed that you plant. If you like bananas, don't plant an apple seed. Don't plant a lemon seed. You're not going to get it. The seed you plant. And with America, the seed we planted is in our Declaration of Independence. It's what produced our American exceptionalism. There are particularly 46 words in the Declaration. There are 3 principles, and these set forth our fundamental beliefs. Now, it used to be in schools, even up to a decade ago, we had what was called Celebrate Liberty Week. And on Celebrate Liberty Week, we had all kids, K through actually, it was first grade through 12, memorize these 46 words out of the Declaration because they all needed to know where our philosophy came from. We rarely do that anymore at all, but Celebrate Liberty Week is what it was, and these are the 46 words. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men. Now, from those 46 words, there's 3 really simple principles that come forth. Those 3 really simple principles and 46 words. The first one is, all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creed. Now, what happens with this is what tells us that there actually is a creator. We believe that there is a divine creator. We're not a secular nation. We're not a secular government. We hear that all the time. No. We start with the belief that there's a divine creator. That's where we start. And by the way, I've been involved in 13 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. Was involved in the case this year. Already involved in the case actually it was the case last year since we're in the first of the year. Already involved in the case for this year. And so many of them deal with some form of religious expression. And what the court has said for a number of decades is, no. If you've got religious faith, that's good, but that doesn't need to be public because we got all sorts of people in America who don't believe in God, they're atheists, or whatever they are, and we just can't take a position for God in the nation. I'm sorry, the Declaration did. At the top, it said, this is the unanimous declaration of 13 United States of America. Every one of our political entities said, hey, we all strongly believe that there is a God. Now, the reason that's important, that's the first step in having a limited government. You will not have a limited government if it's a secular government. You have a limited government when you believe there's a divine creator, because when you believe that there is no creator, then government becomes God. And so what you'll have in any nation is you'll either have a big God or a big government. The more secular you are, the more government you will have. If, for example, you're in Germany right now, Germany does not believe that children belong to parents. If you try to homeschool your children in Germany, you will go to jail because they firmly teach that children are the wards of the state. They belong to the state. Parents have children for the sake of the state. If you're in France and try to share your faith, you will go to jail. They call that proselytization. So anywhere that there's not a God belief, anywhere there's not a belief in a divine creator, you got government telling you what you can and can't do. Government becomes the God. They're the ones who set all the standards. So this is why the Founding Fathers started this way. When you go to George Washington, we own the very first call to prayer that he did in the nation. On the day we finished the Bill of Rights, he issued this call to prayer for the nation. Now, why would he call the nation to stop and thank God? He explains in the first paragraph. This is what he says. He says, it is the duty of all nations. By the way, notice the word duty. If you look up the word duty today in our dictionary, it says that which one ought to do. If you look up the word duty in their dictionary back in that day, it says a legally binding contractual obligation. There's a big difference between a legally binding contractual obligation and what we ought to do. He says it is a legally binding contractual obligation of nations, not of individuals, but of political entities, to do 4 things. What's the legal binding contractual obligation of all political entities? He said, number one, to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Number two, to obey His will. Number three, to be grateful for His benefits. And number four, humbly to implore His protection and favor. And according to George Washington, the day we finished the Bill of Rights, he says, we have a legally binding contractual obligation to do these four things, which is why he stopped and called the nation. By the way, I'll show you later. By the time we get to 1815, there had been 1,400 government-issued calls to prayer by 1815. We really believed it was important to keep people God-conscious. The more you're conscious of God, the less government you need, and we understood that, and that was part of limited government. So that was the first belief of those 46 words in the Declaration. The second one appears, and it says they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now we started with there's a Creator. Now we're saying that Creator gives us a certain set of inalienable rights. This actually is a second step to limiting government because it limits jurisdictions. Let me see if I can explain this. I'm a cowboy from Texas. We've got a ranch in Texas, everything that goes with it, the horses, the cows, everything else. And I've got a red pickup, and I've had a red pickup for several pickups now. I really like red pickups, and they're pretty cool. My son had the audacity to drive a black pickup on the ranch. Not a good idea. So I promptly spray painted his black pickup red because everybody needs a red pickup. Actually, I didn't spray paint this truck. Why? Because it doesn't belong to me. I can spray paint anything I own red. I spray paint my roads red, my fence post red, my grass red, anything, but only what I own. And you see, this is what the Founding Fathers said, hey, government, here's a bunch of things you can't spray paint red. They do not belong to you. You heard tonight about the enumerated powers, the 10th Amendment, very clear. The Constitution only gives 17 specific functions to the federal government. That's it, 17. And that's the only 17 things they're allowed to spray paint red. Anything else is off limits to them. It goes to the states or to the people, 9th Amendment, 10th Amendment, real simple stuff. But we don't even know what the enumerated powers are anymore. You ask most people in Congress, what are the 17 things the Constitution allows you to do as federal congressman? It's going to be hard to find an answer to that because we don't teach civics anymore. We don't teach government. We don't teach limited government. Limited government starts with acknowledging God. And so this is the second thing they point out in the Declaration. Inalienable rights come from God. Now, most people may have a difficult time defining inalienable rights. We talk about it. We can't define it as well as we can talk about it. But inalienable rights are defined by the Founding Fathers. John Dickinson's one of the guys who helped with the Declaration. He's a signer of the Constitution. He defined inalienable rights. He said an inalienable right is a right which God gave to you and which no inferior power has the right to take away. In other words, spray painted red. This is something that God gave you, therefore nobody else is allowed to touch it. But if you don't have a God, then the government's going to touch anything. But we said, no, there's a bunch of things you can't touch. You have a definition also comes from Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton said it this way. He said, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. These things don't come in government documents. He says, they're written as with the sunbeam and the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself and can never be erased or obscured by any world power. These are rights that God gave us, and as a result, no human power can interfere with rights that God gave you. You have also John Adams who said it this way. John Adams said that inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly governments. The rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, the rights that are derived from the great legislator of the universe. So there's a certain set of rights that come from God. Now, we don't really identify those well today. We know what some of them are. The Founding Fathers told us exactly what they were. For example, Sam Adams, who's called the father of the American Revolution, in the early writings he did from 1772 to 1776, explained to America what this revolution was about. Really simple. He said, well, in the Declaration, we told you that among other rights, there was, as he said, first, the right to life, secondly, liberty, thirdly, property, together with the right to defend them. Now, that's four inalienable rights. The right to life, liberty, property, and the right to self-defense. That's four rights. But he said in the Declaration that among others are these four rights. So 11 years later, after we have won the war, after we've established a constitutional government, after we had the debate in the Constitutional Convention on what are the inalienable rights, we came out with the Bill of Rights. We said, you know, we told you in the Declaration there were four. Well, here's some more. And so the First Amendment gives 5 inalienable rights the government's not allowed to touch. The Second Amendment gives 2 inalienable rights. The Third Amendment gives 1. The Fourth and the Eighth Amendments give 12 inalienable rights. Again, most people can't name these rights. The Founding Fathers gave us right at 24 inalienable rights. Those are rights that the government's never allowed to touch ever, if you understand the philosophy of government. See, this is what made us special was we have jurisdictions, and you don't get in the wrong jurisdiction. So that's the second thing, is inalienable rights come from God. The third thing, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, This tells us the primary purpose of civil government. The primary purpose of civil government is to protect our inalienable rights. It's not to make sure the borders are secure. That's not the first purpose, or to make sure we got a job, or make sure the economy is good. The number one purpose of American government is to make sure you have the right to practice the rights that God told you could practice. Now, after that, we'll secure the border, and we'll do the 17 things in the Constitution, but only after we secure your inalienable rights. So this is the starting place for it. And by the way, there's some great quotes on this as well. If you go, for example, back to Sam Adams, the father of the Revolution, he says the government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. This is why we set up the government, because Great Britain didn't protect our inalienable rights. The king told us what we could and couldn't do with our faith, what we could and couldn't do with our guns, what we could and couldn't do with our house, our privacy. He said that we're not doing that. In America, we're doing it different. So that's why we set up the document the way we did. And again, he said first, the right to life, second, liberty, thirdly, the property. Now, right to life is interesting. I've been involved in that battle like a lot of you have for a long time. And so we win Dobbs this year, and that's a huge step in the right direction. But this right to life, it would have really been good if they hadn't been talking about abortion that day, because then we could have been arguing original intent since way back at Roe v. Wade. Because they said, wait a minute, founding fathers wrote about it. We know what they were talking about, because abortion wasn't a deal back then. And what makes us say that? I mean, literally, we own books on abortion from back in the founding era. That's an 1808 book on abortion. Thomas Jefferson, when he did the state legal code for Virginia in 1779, made abortion illegal in 1779. There's nothing new about abortion except the technology. The issue of trying to destroy a child inside has always been there. As long as people were pregnant, people didn't want to be pregnant. That's nothing new. What changes is the technology of how you destroy the child. So we had way back then, they had all sorts of laws on abortion. One of our original Supreme Court justices, James Wilson, we have his original law books where he taught law school in 1791. He's got a big section telling the students why abortion is wrong and why that violates an inalienable right to life. See, we have a lot of history that backs us up, but we don't do a good job of teaching government history today in so many ways. And so this right to life, we don't recognize it as really being part of why we had government. So when you look at those three inalienable rights, the first one was we start with there's an acknowledgement of Creator. The second is we believe that inalienable rights come from God, comes from our Creator. And the third is the primary purpose of government is to protect those inalienable rights. Now, this is the philosophy from which we start. And if you'll notice, it's God, God, God. All three of those are God. See, what you find is a secular government will never be a limited government. I've already mentioned Greece and France. I'm taking through Portugal, through Spain, I'm taking through any other nation. If you don't have a God-conscious view of government, you will have a very heavy-handed government with your rights. And that's what we fail to recognize as Americans. We're just so used to what we have, we just assume we're always going to have it. No. The more secular it becomes, the less you have it. As a matter of fact, we got the debates going in the House right now. This morning I was talking to one of the guys who was on the floor at the time we were talking, and the votes were going down. And now, one of the changes we hope comes out of finally getting the speaker is we get rid of this guy. He's over the Judiciary Committee, Democrat of the Judiciary Committee, and this didn't get publicized much in our news because the media, they agreed with him. But what he said is God's will is of no concern. Don't tell me about God-given rights. There's no God-given rights. We Congress will tell you what your rights are. That's the philosophy we've had on the Judiciary Committee. Hopefully Jim Jordan's going to be the new chairman of the Judiciary Committee is what we hear. See, that's why you got to have God-conscious people in office. You can't have a secular government and expect it to be a limited government. So that's the philosophy on which this is based. I want to show you three areas where we're exceptional. And this is why I think a lot of times we as Americans, we don't know how special we are. We don't protect it, therefore the special aspects that we have. But there's three areas where I want to show you. One aspect of American exceptional is just our overall American goodness. We don't understand how different we are from the rest of the world. Let me take you back for history a minute. And by the way, if you remember George Orwell says, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Two thoughts there. Whoever controls the past controls the future. The way you present history will affect what you're going to become in the future. This is what was so important even when Josiah in the scriptures was trying to restore the temple, and they were doing a really good thing, and then they found that old scroll, and they brought that scroll out, and Josiah read this and said, you mean we used to be like this? It led to a whole change in what they were doing in restoring the temple. He found history, and it took him back to having an original intent view, if you will. And so what happens is, whoever controls the past controls the future. But you know what? Whoever controls the present controls the past. You see, what we're teaching in schools right now is the way we present the past. What we're teaching right now about the past tells us what we're going to be in the future. This is why history is so important. And of all the major topics in school, history is the only course I know of nationally that has no testing at the end of the course. We test on science, we test on reading, we test on English. Teachers teach what's in the test. And if you're not going to test on history, we're not going to have history. And I'll show you what some states are doing as a result of that as well. So going back to this, the College Board is, of course, we know them for the SAT test, the 2 college entry tests, ACT, SAT. College Board does the SAT, but they also do 47 different AP courses. AP courses, these AP courses are courses that you take that are advanced placement so that while you're in high school, you're really sharp in the area, you get college credit while you're in high school. One of the 47 courses they do is on AP U.S. History. So they come out with the only AP test for U.S. history in the nation. It came out in 2014 with it. 2015 they updated it. And as you look at what they came out with, it's 162 pages of standards. So if a kid goes and takes the AP history test, they've got to study those 162 pages of standards because that's where the questions are coming from, is out of those 100. And there's 460,000 kids a year in America that take this AP test, and they are the ones that do the AP test. And it's interesting, when I review standards, when I'm looking at standards, what I look for is, I don't look for what's in the standards, I look for what's not in the standards. For example, if we had a standard that said Abraham Lincoln dropped an atomic bomb on Thailand to end World War XIV, we would say, you are crazy, you've lost your brains. However, if we stopped talking about Abraham Lincoln for about 30 years, we could come back in 30 years and say anything we wanted to about Lincoln because nobody knows who he is. And so I look to see what's missing out of the standards because that tells me what the future is going to be. Let me show you what was missing out of the standards, the AP standards that came out. And you look at the standards, and what you find is we don't think there's any founding fathers. We didn't mention Jefferson, we didn't mention Franklin, John, we didn't mention the founding fathers. They didn't exist. We didn't even mention the American War for Independence. None of the major battles. We didn't mention Lexington. We didn't mention Bunker Hill or Saratoga or Yorktown. None of that was there. And we didn't even get into the Civil War. We didn't think Lincoln was important. That's the key to the Civil War. There was nothing on Gettysburg Address, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln did not appear in the standards, and the Civil War didn't appear in the standards. Not the North, not the South. There's not a single battle of the Civil War that appeared in the AP history standards. Top kids in America. We didn't do anything in World War II. You moved in the 20th century. We didn't cover World War II. None of the battles. None of the heroes of World War II. No major leaders. We didn't have Eisenhower or Patton. We didn't have MacArthur or Nimitz. None of those guys. We didn't even have the enemy in there. We didn't even mention Hitler. We didn't mention the Nazis. We didn't mention the Holocaust. This is what 460,000 kids a year are getting on the test. 162 pages they study for the test, and none of this appears in the standards. Man, if this doesn't, then what have they got in there? Interesting. Glad you asked that. What they have is the decision to drop the atomic bomb raised questions about American values. Now, you didn't say anything about Japan. You didn't say anything about Germany. You didn't say Hitler or the Holocaust. You just said America dropped an atomic bomb, which raised questions about American values. You'll go through the course, and America's the only one you feel bad about because we're the ones who dropped the atomic bomb. You know, there's a little more to the story than that, and that's what we don't get. Why would that raise questions about American values? Let me take you back to World War II, just a quick primer. You may recall there were 68 million deaths in World War II. You had some 20 million deaths in the Pacific, some 48 million deaths in the European theater, and all the deaths that we had, when you see what happened, it all starts at Pearl Harbor. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, at that point in time, we thought we were getting along with the rest of the world. We didn't know this was coming. Our intelligence didn't have this going. We didn't know what was about to happen. But what happens is after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan declares war on us. So we said, all right, you're declaring war on us. We're declaring war on you, especially after you just had 3,000 Americans and killed them. So we declared war on them. And when we declared war on them, the next day, over the next 2 days, Mussolini and Hitler declared war on America. Said, if you're going after Tojo, we're going after you. So after we declared war on Japan, then here came Hitler and Mussolini. And so after Italy and Germany declared war on us, we declared war on them. So in a period of 4 days, we have 6 declarations of war. 3 against us and 3 that we gave against other nations. So we're fully at war, we're completely at war. And our problem with World War II was we were still thinking World War I. If you remember the famous line about World War I, this was the war to end all wars. we were so tired of war, we would never ever have another war ever. This is the last world war we're ever going to have. And we made sure of that because we wanted to make sure we did not threaten anyone. So when we got bombed at Pearl Harbor, we were still flying World War II biplanes because that's not a threat to anybody. And on top of that, we were still using World War I tanks. Now, this is the kind of stuff that we had going at that point in time. We're still thinking World War I because if we're not a threat to anybody, everybody will leave us alone. Well, that's a really stupid idea. We've found that out a lot of times since then. But our belief was if we don't threaten anybody else, they're going to leave us alone. Well, here we get hit in December of 1941, and we still have got World War I technology. So what happens over that period of time is we start turning out vehicles at an amazing rate. We turn out Sherman tanks. We were literally, Detroit was turning out a B-24 bomber every 55 minutes off the assembly line in Detroit. And may I contrast that with the fact that it took us 3.5 years to get a stupid healthcare website up? You know, we turned out a bomber in 55 minutes. We can't have a website. So we're turning out bombers. We're turning out all sorts of stuff. We were turning a Liberty ship out of the shipyards every 4 days. We had a Liberty ship turning out of the ship. It's amazing what we did, but it took us a year to be able to go to war. We did not go to war until November of 1942. November 42, 11 months later, we said, we're now ready to go fight the enemy. So what we did was we loaded up on boats. We put George Patton in charge of it, and it's called Operation Torch. We went to the northwest part of Africa. He lands there, and he starts getting all these troops off, and he starts marching across the north part of Africa. He gets in and fighting with Rommel's troops, and he defeats Rommel. We go across North Africa. They get to Sicily, and they go through Italy, and now they're getting ready to go into Germany. It's time for D-Day. So we've been pushing the Germans back. We've got an army now. Patton's doing a really good job. And as we get ready for D-Day, Patton is the best general we've got. He's winning everywhere. The Germans don't like him. They kept him under watch more than any other general. And so what happens is he goes over to Dover, England, and he starts building the force for D-Day. And the Germans see it, and they know it's coming. And they know that D-Day is coming. They know they're about to get pounded. You see, they had intelligence. They were flying planes over England. And they saw all these tanks that were getting out in fields. Just fields started filling up with tanks. You see all these tanks there? Patton's building this massive army, except it's all a lie. Here's some of the tanks that they were putting out in the field. They were inflatables. We put all these inflatables in here. They're putting a turret on one of the tanks. So the Germans flying intelligence on top are seeing this huge buildup in the military, and so Patton's about to lead this big force on D-Day, and they're getting ready for this big force to come in, and even our planes were all fake. These are fake planes. The fighters we had were plywood, but from the air, they looked like a whole squadron of fighters down there on the airfield. So we had this all over Dover, and the reason was they thought we were going to attack Calais, France, which is only 23 miles across the channel. That's logical. That's the closest place. That's where we're going to attack. So Patton's over there, and they've got all their attention on him. And what they missed was Patton wasn't part of the attack. We used him specifically as a decoy. He wasn't the one that led it. It came from way over. And so the 5 beaches we had at D-Day were hundreds of miles away from where the Germans thought. But the good news was because we had Patton over there, and he was doing all sorts of press conferences talking about the invasion was coming, they moved thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of German troops up where they thought the attack was coming from. So even though we lost 3,000 guys on D-Day, we would have lost a whole lot more if Patton hadn't been able to pull the rest of them up there. So D-Day hits, and so we start landing on D-Day. We go with all the stuff that we know that happens on D-Day and all the lives that were lost and all the things that were happening as a result of D-Day. And so after D-Day, then Hitler, and D-Day, by the way, was called Operation Overlord. And after that, then we now fly Patton back over to take charge of the troops again. Now that we've done with him as a decoy, now we're going to put him back to really whacking the enemy. And so he takes, and so we drive Hitler back into Germany. Hitler kills himself, and that's the end of the German side. So once the German side is over, it's now time to pay attention to the Pacific side. So we then turn to Japan, and we have B-29 bombers now. We start just bombing the daylights out of Japan. I mean, we're dropping bombs. I can't tell you how many thousands of bombs we were dropping at a time. And there were 105 nations involved in World War II. And at this point in time, when we're bombing Japan, that's the only enemy nation left. Every other enemy nation's gone. They don't have a single ally. and we've still got the Allies all together. We got the we've got the Russians, and we've got the French, and we've got the British, and the New Zealanders, and the Australians, and the Americans. And so we just bomb the daylights out of them, and they won't give up. Guys, you've got no way of winning. There's no path to victory. Give up. And they won't give up. And we keep bombing, and they won't give up. And so it's that, we may have to invade Japan just like we invaded Germany. Operation Overlord was D-Day. We may have to have Operation Downfall. So this was the map. They said, here's where the American army will come in. Here's where the British will come in. So we've got all this planned. If we have to go into Japan and invade them. And so the problem with Japan was we found in World War II, we don't understand this today because they're such a different people, but in World War II, they were a culture that glorified death and dying. They really were the ISIS of the day, no question about it. If you look at what was happening that day, mass suicides were really common. If you look at as we did the island hopping going to the Pacific, we did not lose a single battle in the Pacific island hopping, but there were super high casualties. I mean, super high. How come? Because the Japanese gave every Japanese family a hand grenade and said, if the Americans win, make sure you blow yourself and your children up. We don't want any survivors. And so that's why after some battles, there might be just a handful of people left on the island because they all killed themselves in mass suicides. We're not used to people thinking like that. And then we found the Chinese genocide. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, but the Chinese killed the Japanese killed 10 million Chinese. They hated the Chinese like Hitler hated the Jews. And so beheading was super common. And so they wiped out 10 million Chinese, and they're training their teenagers to do all the killing. Now, we know that ISIS does this with young kids, and we saw some in Vietnam. But we didn't understand this. But these teenagers had 3,400 suicide bombs, suicide attacks against allies. It's amazing to see. These are, you hear the kamikaze planes, the Japanese warriors, the Japanese kids, they had these small planes that they would also fly into ships. And then even torpedoes. Now, why not just shoot a torpedo to the ship and blow it up? No, we're going to drive the torpedo to the ship and blow us up as we blow the torpedo up. So this death mentality was something the Americans just weren't accustomed to. And of course, it's all documented. All the footage is there. And then even what they did in the prisoner of war camps. The Japanese officers would have competitions to see who could behead 100 prisoners the fastest. They would line 100 prisoners up for each officer, and you just go down the road, knocking heads off. Oh, you won this time. You were faster. You did 100 better than me. And then sometimes they had ties and would bring out 10 more prisoners and behead 10 more to see who could do the runoff. I mean, this is not the way we think, but it was definitely part of what was going on. So the prisoner treatment, what we have with Bataan Death March, what we have with Saipan, if you were sick, if you were slow, if you were tired, they just killed you, which led to one of the war posters we had in World War II that talked about how the Japs abandoned U.S. wounded campus from Pacific Island. And it says, this isn't war, this is murder. I mean, this is the way they thought that we don't even see anymore as World War II today. So what happens with this culture that glorifies death and dying, this question is, okay, if we have to invade Japan, how many lives will we lose? General Curtis LeMay was charged of the Army Air Corps. And they came back to him and said, you've been bombing, but if we have to invade, we have to do a D-Day invasion. The projections we have right now is we'll lose somewhere between 1 million Americans, we'll lose in the vicinity of 2 to 4 million Allied forces, and you will have to kill between 5 and 10 million Japanese before they give up. So you're looking at 15 million if you have to do an invasion. 15 million more lives? We're tired of 68 million. Why 15 million more? And that's when Truman said, you know what? Last week we tried to bomb out in the desert and it worked. Let's do that. He said, put that on the plane. So they put it on the plane, they flew to Saipan, they put it on the plane, they took it to USS Indianapolis, who went to Saipan, dropped the bomb off for the Enola Gay, and then came back. And that's when the USS Indianapolis was torpedoed and sank, the biggest naval disaster in American history. It happened so fast, 18 minutes, we never even knew the ship went down. And so they rescued us, and you've seen the Hollywood movie on that. So we say, okay, we'll use this bomb. So what happens is on the 6th of August of 1945, we drop the bomb. And we drop another one 3 days later. We're planning to drop one every 3 days until the Japanese give up. Now, the two bombs we dropped, the Japanese, they didn't give up on the 6th, they didn't give up on the 9th. We were going to drop one on the 12th. We said, let us think about it a little more. We gave them some more days. They gave up on the 14th. So what happened was, in those two bombs, we lost 300,000 total Japanese lost their lives. 150,000 from the blast, 150,000 more from radiation over the next 2 years. So we're talking 300,000 Japanese deaths versus what could have been 15 million. Why are we the bad guys in this? Well, why do we question American values? Well, I don't understand what the problem is with American values. It looks to me like we save 14.7 million lives. That ought to be something that's laudable. No. We don't talk about that. As a matter of fact, did you know that in one prisoner of war camp, the Japanese beheaded more prisoners in one camp than we killed with 2 atomic bombs? We never do that. They beheaded more in one Allied camp than we killed with 2 atomic bombs. See, and we're the ones that have problems with values. Americans are the ones who have the bad values. And then when you look at what happened, we didn't drop a bomb in Japan until after we first dropped 70 million leaflets in Japan. We own these leaflets, part of the collection we have. These 70 million leaflets, on the backside of the leaflet says Japanese people. We are going to destroy 35 Japanese cities because that's where military production occurs. We do not want to lose a single person in those cities, so we're telling civilians to get away from these cities because these are the 35 we're going to, and we listed Nagasaki, we listed Hiroshima as the 35 cities that we're going to bomb, part of the 35 cities. And by the way, didn't make American pilots happy because guess where the Japanese set up all their anti-aircraft guns? Around those 35 cities. We jeopardized American lives to try to save Japanese civilians. And so we dropped these leaflets, and we even set up what was called KSAI, Saipan. We set up a radio station. We broadcast every 15 minutes on the island of Japan saying, Japanese people, the atomic bomb is coming. Every 15 minutes we told them, say, get away from the city. This massive, they said, you've seen what the B-29s can do? We have one bomb that can do what 2,000 B-29 bombers did. Get away from the city. Every 15 minutes we broadcast that out of the island. And we're the ones with the bad values in this thing? I don't think I understand. And then, by the way, this is the cities today. They've been rebuilt. Who rebuilt them? America rebuilt them. We didn't have any obligation to rebuild what we destroyed, but we did, because that's who we are as Americans. Now, see, this is a whole different look at what happened, and this is what we have in the current AP history standards. This is what kids are getting taught now, not the good side of America, the bad side of America. This is why we're so gullible for CRT and other things. It's called deconstruction. Deconstruction goes back to 1980. Howard Zinn came out, and instead of saying the good, the bad, the ugly about America, which every historian should give you the good, bad, ugly, all he did was bad and ugly, and some of the bad and ugly he flat made up. It didn't have anything to do with fact. And so this is what we've had a steady diet of through academics, through universities, through colleges, through schools for a long time, is deconstruction. I told you I'd give you some other information about what happened with standards this year. Every state does their standards at a different pace. In Texas, every 13 years we do our history standards. In Minnesota, they do it every 10 years. Every state's different. So, this year, history standards, Louisiana, Minnesota, etc. It's interesting that Minnesota, Louisiana, other states came out with a state law this year that said for the next 10 years in our state, we are not going to teach the American Revolution or the Civil War or World War I or World War II or the Holocaust for the next 10 years. We won't cover any of that in our history standards. This is current stuff now. I went to Louisiana. Tim and I went to Louisiana, my son, and we testified in the Louisiana legislature because they were trying to stop this. They said, no, we're going to teach World War II because New Orleans has the World War II museum. I mean, we're going to teach World War II, we're going to teach the Holocaust. We got there, even New Orleans, a very red state, very conservative state, and they said, no, we're not going to teach the Civil War, we're not going to teach World War II. So the sponsors actually had to draw the bill back. We couldn't protect it because it was getting voted down. And so they left it the status quo rather than get the new stuff. See, this is going on all over the nation. So what happens is we're historically illiterate about who we are as Americans. We don't know our own story. Two other things I'll give you real quickly. One is not only are we exceptional and good, just really goodness, we're the way we are to other nations and very different from other nations. But when you look at race relations, and this is where we've gotten beat up a lot in the last 5 years, we're told that, you know, all the guys who founded this country, they didn't like racism. So this is part of the Marxism. We've seen all these different groups have been doing this for 5 years, and they've been pushing this stuff. And so critical race theory, 1619 Project, BLM, you name it, it's all out there. And the mantra is, America's founded by a bunch of white guys. Now, I will point out, that's a bunch of white guys. And they are the founders of the United States. These are guys who did the Declaration. But let me ask you a question. Those guys right there, this painting was done in 1821. It was done nearly 50 years after they signed the Declaration. At the time this painting was done, nearly none of those guys were alive. There was just a handful left, and none of them looked like that. They were all really old at that point in time. So how did they paint that painting? How do we know what those guys looked like? And here's the deal. If you did something really significant in the nation, whether you were a religious leader, whether you were a military general, whether you're a political leader, if you did something really significant, they would paint a portrait of you because it's worth having next generations know the great stuff you did. So what happened when John Trumbull painted this in 1821, he went around and gathered up all the portraits of these guys, laid all the portraits out, and he painted the painting based on the portraits. That's as close as you get as a photograph. This painting hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. It is 14 feet high, it is 20 feet wide. It is like a life-size painting of these 56 individuals. Yeah, but you know what problem we have? There's a whole lot of paintings from back then that aren't of white guys. And it's just that today we don't know. You know, if we start trying to name who these guys were, probably we don't have a clue who they are. But they're painted. How come? Because they did really significant stuff. The fact that we don't talk about it doesn't mean that they didn't do significant stuff. I'll just give you an example. This guy right here, that guy right there is Harry Hoosier. He is actually a minister. Harry Hoosier was in what was called the Second Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening, you had all these famous guys that rode across America. And as a cowboy, I'm really impressed. One of the famous guys, well, you had George Whitefield, and you had John Wesley and Charles Wesley. But you also had Francis Asbury, who goes just across sharing God with the nation. This guy rode 300,000 miles on horseback in the process of sharing good news with people. That's 12 times around the world on horseback. I can't imagine how many hours in the saddle it was. But he said, you know, even though he drew large crowds and Whitfield drew large crowds, they said, Harry Hoosier draws larger crowds than we do. The black guy gets bigger crowds than the white guys do. And then Benjamin Rush, who went to his meeting, said he's the greatest orator I ever heard. Wait a minute, you're running around with Patrick Henry and these famous guys, and you're saying Harry's the best orator? You see, Harry was really popular with what we would call blue-collar guys, and they were the guys who loved the frontiers. These are the guys who became the woodsmen, the explorers, the trappers, the trailblazers, and they loved him, but they were rough and tumble guys, too. They cussed a lot, they fought a lot, they drank a lot, and then they would find God, and they didn't fight so much, and they didn't cuss so much, and they didn't drink so much. And what happened was, Harry really did a lot of these revivals along the East Coast, Philadelphia and Delaware and Jersey. But by 1808, 1809, 1810, America was starting to move west. And as we moved west, these frontier guys said, that's for us. We want to go because we love that rough stuff. And so they get out there, and as they get out west, a lot of these other trappers look at the Harry Hoosier converts, and they say, man, those guys are really acting strange. They don't do what we do. What's up with them? And the answer was, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. Hoosiers. It happened to be the Indiana Territory is where they were. Now, I wonder how many people who live in Indiana today know that they were named after black evangelists. Probably very few. That's a whole lot of people. It would seem like if a guy had a state named after him, you might put him in your history book somewhere. No, we can't show that any good thing happened with any black person. That's not the way it was. They were all racist back then. And so not only do you have Harry Hoosier, let me give you one more. If I take you over here on the bottom left, you see this guy right there riding horseback? His name is Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell, interesting thing about Wentworth Cheswell, he made a Paul Revere-like ride. And that's why they painted him on that horse. He went riding through New Hampshire, warning the people the British were coming. And what's significant about Wentworth Cheswell, as he's making this ride, nobody even knows that, but they don't even know who the guy is. The guy was elected to office in 1768. Whoa, a black guy elected to office in 1768 in a white community? Yep. And he was re-elected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions in New Hampshire. And that was in 1768. And so this is one of the many documents we have of Wentworth Cheswell. And here's all the other offices he was elected to over that part of time. And so you look at Wentworth Cheswell and you say, we got a black guy elected to office back in 1768, a black guy in a white community. Well, that's not that impressive. Let's go back earlier than that. Instead of just going with 1768, let's go back to 1641. Matthias D'Souza was a black guy elected in a white community to the state legislature of Maryland in 1641. Really? Yeah. Matter of fact, by the time you get to 1876 in America, we have elected thousands of black persons to office in America in largely white communities. Now, I can go through and give you names of most of them, but we don't study that. And just for context, when did Great Britain elect their first black person to office? 1987. When did Russia elect their first black person in office? 2010. We did it in 1641, and we're the bad guy. We're the racists in the world? Are you kidding? Who knows this? So all of these guys have stories, and that used to be what we have in our textbooks, is the stories. We told these stories. And so one more area where I'll show you that's a lot of fun is dealing with the aspect of our faith, just religious faith. Because we hear so often, these are university professors, America's unchristian beginnings. The founding fathers were deists who rejected the divinity of Jesus. And you have the founding fathers who were not Christians. And you have this one, authors of the Declaration were enemies of Christ. The problem we have with this, and the reason this is so wrong, is when I was at Duke University Law School and put that up, and the sharp kids at Duke Law School, I put that up and said, here's the guys who founded the nation. How many names can you give me? Call them by name. Tell me who you can find. And they could all find Jefferson. They could all find Franklin. Well, good for you. You found the two least religious guys in America. How about the other 54? They couldn't name a single one. As a matter of fact, we do a lot of schools. We carry a Chick-fil-A gift card. Give you $10 if you can name 5 founding fathers. Call them by name and point out who. We've had the same gift card for years. Nobody has it. And that's with adults too, by the way. That's not just kids at school. So if down here, who in the world is Richard Henry Lee? Or beside him, you got Sam Adams. Beside him is George Clinton. The guy looking backwards out to directions, Charles Carroll. The guy leaning on his elbow there in the front row, Robert Morris. Beside him is Benjamin Rush. Then you have Elbridge Gerry. And you just keep going through. I can take you through all of them. They're all significant, did great things. We don't have a clue who they are today. But it's interesting to me that nearly every one of these guys were involved in Christian ministry, and 29 of them graduated with seminary degrees out of some type of Bible institution, Bible. And they're all a bunch of atheists? Really? A bunch of these, they're all, nearly all involved in Christian ministry, just a few weren't. So we don't know much about them. And if you go back to the very beginning, the first time Congress got together was in September 1774. That's where the Continental Congress begins. And according to John Adams and the records of Congress, they started the first Congress with a 2-hour prayer meeting. That's what they did in Congress, was pray for 2 hours. John Adams wrote his wife Abigail about it and told her what they had done. And so, in writing Abigail, he gives a lot of details on what happened that first morning, 2 hours of prayer. And so, as you look at prayer, that became so significant. I mentioned earlier that we start doing these official prayer proclamations. And so by 1814, you literally have 1815, you have 1,400 prayer proclamations issued in America now. We own about 900 of the originals of these. Well, let me just take one. You see John Hancock right there? John Hancock, founding father. This is a prayer proclamation of his that we own. This is one of the originals. And he called his faith to prayer on 22 separate occasions. We have proclamations. What did he have the people praying for? Just to give you a proclamation. He says, we need to pray and fast that the kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ may be established in peace and righteousness among all the nations of the earth. He's an atheist? Really? That's more than I hear most God people talk about. And that's an atheist? See, this is what we get told on a regular basis, and it doesn't hold up when you go back and see that. It doesn't even hold up if you look at textbooks prior to World War II. This is all stuff that's come in recent years. 1781, we win the Battle of Yorktown. As a result, the British lay down their arms, which means we're no longer under British law. It doesn't matter what the king says. One of the laws the king passed back in late 1600s was, if you live in America, you can't print any Bible in the English language. We will tell you what Bible to use. So, if he's King's of Anglican, we're all going to have an Anglican Bible. If he's a Catholic, we'll have a Catholic. We don't get a choice in Bibles. But once we win the War for Independence, we can now do Bibles, and we did. Within 11 months, we typeset and came out with the first Bible in America that's in English, printed here in America. And an interesting thing about that Bible is it's printed at the bottom. It says, printed in Philadelphia by Robert Aiken, that guy right there. Now, why is that significant? Because he's the official printer of Congress. He prints all the stuff for Congress. And if you look inside that Bible, it's interesting. It has a congressional committee that oversaw the Bible. And then it has an endorsement in the front. It says, resolved, the United States and Congress assembled recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States. And by the way, when Congress was doing this, we explained to Congress that this Bible, this is what they said, this Bible is, quote, it's a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools. The Founding Fathers, Congress, we get a Bible for the use of schools. I thought they didn't want the Bible in schools. It's what we've been told for a long time. That's not at all what happened. Actually, here's the handwritten memorial on a neat edition of the Bible for the use of schools. So this is one of the rarest books in the world. They printed 10,000 back then. There's about 32, 33 left now. Most are in institutions' hands. There's about 8 left in private hands between myself and Glenn Beck. We've got 3 of the 8 that are left in private hands. And it's a phenomenal book showing history that nobody knows about. And so much was this the way we thought that if you go to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1844, there's a case called Vidal versus Girard's Executors, where the Supreme Court, with an 8-0 unanimous decision, said, look, if you're going to be a government-funded school, you will have scriptures in school. We're not going to have any government-funded school that won't teach scriptures. A unanimous decision by the Supreme Court? We haven't heard that. What we hear is what happened in 1962, 63. Abbott Shemp, Mary Corlett, Ingle Vitale, where the court says, you know, we've had prayer and scripture in schools for 170 years, but we're not doing that anymore. This is kind of like the Roe v. Wade. This was a judicial activism where the court came in and said, we're going to make national policy now. We're working our tails off to get back from that. And by the way, we usually win a religious liberty case at the Supreme Court every 5 to 6 years. We won 5 religious liberty cases at the Supreme Court last year. We, as people of faith, we are starting to win battles that are cultural battles. Now our kids don't know anything about it, but we have the ability to do more things now, including in school, than we've ever been able to do. But we're historically illiterate even about our faith. I'll give you one more example of faith, and then I'll shut down for the night. I want to take you back to the Battle of the Bulge, World War II. Fun stuff in World War II from the standpoint of what we don't know. They're really fun stories. World War II, Battle of the Bulge happens over a 6-week period of time. And in a 6-week period of time, after we landed over there on the 5 D-Day beaches, the plan was we're going to go across France and shove the Germans back into Germany, and we're going to take care of the Germans, and that's going to end the war. That's literally what we did. Now, in that line, that box that we had there, the top part of it was the First Army, General Courtney Hodges. The bottom part of it was General Patton, the Third Army. So they're pushing Hitler back in, and Patton's intelligence guys tell him, we keep seeing crap. We see all these crack German units that are disappearing, and they're not here anymore, and that's up where Courtney Hodges was. And so Patton's guys said, we think the Germans are taking their crack units, and they're about to counterattack up north. And Blitzkrieg was, you hit the enemy in one narrow point with everything you got, you break through, you get on the backside of them, and you start fighting from both sides. And so what the Germans did was they took 1,800 tanks, and they took 200,000 men, and they went up the high part of the Alps where nobody thought they could go, and they went right through Courtney Hodges' lines. They got 80 miles behind them on the other side, and then they turned around and started attacking Courtney Hodges, the First Army, from the front and the back. Patton says, I'm going to have to go rescue them. Eisenhower says, go save their tail. So Patton has to pull off what he's doing against the Germans and go up there to save Courtney Hodges. And as Patton heads up there to save him, he has a real problem, because of the 12 tanks that were used in World War II, the Sherman tank that we had was only the 9th best. Every German tank was better than our tanks, the Panzers, the Tigers. And so our tanks were good if you were fighting artillery, if you're fighting soldiers. They're not good when you're fighting tanks. So we took out German tanks by P-51s and P-47. We took planes and just blew the German tanks up. But Patton has had this thing where for 6 weeks he's not seen daylight in 6 weeks. And we've destroyed 91% of the German Air Force. We should be winning this. We should have it over. If we just had good weather, we wouldn't have to put up with it, because we'd have our planes in the air, and we'd take the rest of the tanks out, and then our tanks would take their soldiers out, and we would be at the end of World War II. And so what happened is General Patton called in General James O'Neill. James O'Neill was the chaplain over all of the Third Army, and Patton looked at him and said, O'Neill, he said, you got a prayer for weather? And O'Neill said, I don't know. I'll check the prayer books and see. He came back and said, I can't find any prayer for weather, but I'll write you one. He said that Patton at that time turned his back on him and went over and looked out the window. There was rain all everywhere. And Patton stood there with his hands behind his back. He said, do our soldiers in the Third Army pray? And Chaplain O'Neill said, sure they pray. That's why we have chaplains. We have services. He said, no. Do our soldiers pray? He said, well, there's no atheists in foxholes. Yeah, they pray. He said, no. I want to know, does every one of our soldiers pray? And what he told him is I want all 250,000 of my men praying. And so what happened was General O'Neill came up with the prayer card. This is the prayer card that was distributed to every man of the Third Army. It's a prayer for weather. It says, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we've had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle, graciously hearken to us, soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among nations and men. And by the way, it was signed on the back, Merry Christmas by Patton, because this is how we spent Christmas of 1944. It was in the Battle of the Bulge. So what happens is he gets his prayer card done, and he's moving toward Luxembourg. And as he gets into Luxembourg, and by the way, most people don't have a clue, but Patton really was a man of faith. He taught Sunday school classes, he taught kids. He was a very coarse man, but he was a man who feared God and a man of faith who was very God-fearing. And it's an interesting thing that as he was marching through Europe and pushing the Germans back, in Europe, they have a lot of these churches that we would call high church. There's a lot of statues in them. That's the term often used for churches with a lot of statues, the saints and Jesus, and etc. And so as he would go through towns after having conquered them, he would always stop at the church, and he would go in and find a statue of Jesus. And his officers would go in with him, his staff, his immediate staff would go in, and they recorded what happened, and they actually talked about what he would do. He would take his helmet off, he would go over to the statue of Jesus, he'd stand there and look up at Jesus and say, "Sir, here's what we did last week. We wiped out this village, we took this town." He said, "The next week I'm going to be over here. I really need your help over here." And he would just give Jesus a briefing, just as if it was Eisenhower. He just briefed him every town he went through. And so he'd stop in the churches, and so the staff writes all this down. And so as he's going into the Battle of the Bulge, he sets up headquarters in Luxembourg. And when he stopped in Luxembourg, it's called his Battle of the Bulge prayer. What happened in Luxembourg was he went into the church, and he did the same thing. And they painted this in 1947 based on all the officers that were with him. He's holding his helmet, and he really got ticked off. He says, "I thought you were on my side. You've been helping us. Now we've got this weather." And this is part of his prayer. I'll just read part of his prayer. They wrote it down. "Sir," he's talking to God, "Sir, I can't help but feel that I've offended you in some way. That suddenly you've lost all sympathy with our cause. That you are throwing in with von Rundstedt and his paper-hanging god Hitler." He says, "You know without me telling you that our situation is desperate. Sure, I can tell my staff that everything is going according to plan, but there's no use me telling you that my 101st Airborne is holding out against tremendous odds in Bastogne." He says, he continued, he says, "Without your cooperation from a weather standpoint, I'm deprived of an accurate disposition of the German armies, and how can I be intelligent in my attack?" He says, "All this probably sounds unreasonable to you, but I've lost all patience with your chaplains who keep insisting that this is a typical winter and you're just going to have to go through it. This is what happens every winter in Germany." He says, "You just got to make up your mind whose side you're on. He said, "You must come to my assistance so that I may dispatch the entire German army as a birthday present to your Prince of Peace." He actually said, "If you'll give me 4 days of good weather, I'll send you so many Germans, your bookkeepers and everyone won't be able to keep up with all the Germans I send you." So he left having said the prayer, and interesting, that's the day before is when they started praying those prayer cards, 250,000 guys praying for change in weather, and the next day the weather changed. It changed remarkably. It is in all of the after-action reports of the Third Army, and they say a miracle happened, the weather changed, the forecast was for bad weather, the sky's clear, they had answered prayers, and they got planes in the air, and they destroyed all the German tanks, and they saved the 101st Airborne. It took 6 weeks, we got on track, and then go in, Hitler kills himself, and that ends the war. So when Patton was leaving Luxembourg, it's interesting, he stopped back by the church, and he had another prayer. He said, "Sorry about being mad at you earlier, and you really had this under control. I really appreciate that." It's like he apologized for having been mad in his previous prayer. And so then he gets back on, and this is how the war ends. So the faith aspect is just huge throughout all of American history, and kids don't get any coverage of any of this today. And it's not a good thing. So closing out for the night, we're exceptional in so many areas. The inherent goodness of America is so different. The racial relations so different from what we hear. Goodness in the racial relations, and also on a religious faith. We're just a different nation from many others, and that's what's made us special. Here's the challenge I'll close with. Benjamin Rush, again, one of my favorite founding fathers. He was one of the favorite other founding fathers as well. He is called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He started 5 universities. He started academic education for women. He started medical training for black physicians. He just did so many things. But he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution because of this piece that he did in 1790. He said, "We used to be 13 nations, now we're one nation with 13 states." And if we're going to stay a nation, what do we have to teach in our schools if we're going to stay a nation? And he said the purpose of public education is threefold. He said the number one purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the number two purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their country. He said the number three purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, interestingly, and by the way, this is what we did in public education until the Supreme Court got involved in 62, 63, then judicial activism. But notice the order. Nearly every person of faith I know of would say, no, 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 no. It should be God and family and country, because family is so much more important. And that's the way most people see it, is God, family, and country. And he said, no, you're wrong. He said it should be God and then country and then family. And he explained, he said, if you ever lose control of your country will become the great enemy of your family, which is exactly what we're finding now. We haven't been in school boards for a long time, and guess what's happened to our schools? And we haven't been involved in local elections now. Is only about 4 to 6% turnout in most local elections. We haven't been involved, and therefore it's hard to keep good government when we don't get involved. We should be involved in government just so we can lead a quiet, peaceful life and get government to leave us alone. If we were involved in it, it's not going to do nearly as much as when you're not involved with and give it over to people who have their philosophy. So I would challenge you to help distribute that philosophy to conservatives across the state, conservatives throughout the city. Republicans need to get their thinking right on this as well. And that's a great charge for us, literally, is to go back to that mentality. And what you're doing with the 10th Amendment stuff and going back to it with the federalism. And by the way, this is another problem with education, is 70% of Americans oppose federalism because they think federalism means an increase in the federal government. Federalism means a decrease in the federal government. Federalism means the separation of powers between the local and the state and the federal. We don't even get that anymore. So you now have to go back to redefining basic terms just to get people to understand what we're doing. Because if you talk about a federalism project, they say, well, I'm against that. I don't want more federal government. Yeah, I don't either. That's why we have a federalism project. So this is a great thing you guys got going on. Thanks for letting me share with you tonight. If you're interested in this stuff, we've got books at the back table.